1649. The King of England walked toward execution before his own people. Kings were believed to rule by divine right, but England was about to shatter that belief forever. Years of conflict divided the kingdom in two. King and Parliament had gone to war. This was more than a civil war. It was a battle to decide who truly ruled England. To understand how a king reached the execution block, we must return to the beginning of the Stuart Age. In 1603, the Tudor dynasty came to an end with the death of Elizabeth I. James VI of Scotland became King James I of England. For the first time, England and Scotland were ruled by the same monarch. But James's reign would soon bring him into conflict with Parliament. Then, a conspiracy emerged that nearly changed English history forever. In 1605, one of the greatest assassination plots in English history was set in motion. The plan was simple: blow up Parliament and kill King James in a single explosion. At the last moment, the conspiracy was uncovered. Guy Fawkes was captured before he could strike. From that day on, Britain remembered the failed plot every 5th of November. The king had survived, but his struggle with Parliament was only beginning. James wanted to unite more than his kingdoms. He wanted to unite the faith of his people. To achieve this, he commissioned a new English translation of the Bible. Published in 1611, the King James Bible became one of the most influential books in English history. At the same time, England was beginning to look beyond the Atlantic toward a new world. Across the ocean, England's first permanent colony was about to change history forever. In 1607, English ships sailed across the Atlantic toward the New World. In Virginia, they founded Jamestown, England's first permanent settlement in America. Starvation, disease, and brutal winters pushed the colony to the brink of collapse. But Jamestown survived, becoming the first foundation of Britain's future empire in America. While England expanded overseas, a far greater conflict was beginning at home. In 1625, King James I died. His son, Charles I, inherited the throne. Charles believed that kings ruled by the divine will of God. But Parliament had no intention of giving the king unlimited power. With every passing year, the conflict between the crown and Parliament grew more dangerous. Soon, Charles would make a decision that pushed England to the edge of rebellion. In 1628, Parliament presented the king with a historic document. The Petition of Right declared that the king could not impose taxes or imprison people without lawful cause. Charles accepted the document, but he had little intention of obeying it. That decision set England on a path from which there would be no turning back. The king would soon rule alone, without Parliament, for 11 long years. In 1629, Charles dissolved Parliament. For the next 11 years, he ruled England without Parliament. New taxes, especially ship money, sparked growing anger across the kingdom. But the greatest crisis was about to begin in Scotland. Charles tried to impose his will on Scotland, and instead ignited a rebellion that would force Parliament back into power. Charles attempted to impose the English Church upon Scotland. The Scots resisted. Through the National Covenant, they openly challenged the king's authority. The Bishops' Wars of 1639 ended in humiliation for Charles. Unable to finance his army, Charles had no choice but to summon Parliament once again. But the Parliament, Charles recalled, would soon become his greatest enemy. In 1640, Charles summoned Parliament once again. This time, there would be no turning back. Members of Parliament began demanding answers. Years of frustration were finally coming to the surface. The king's most trusted advisor, Thomas Wentworth, Earl of Strafford, was accused of treason. In 1641, Strafford was executed. Charles had lost his most loyal ally. With trust completely broken, the king made one final desperate move, one that would ignite civil war. In 1642, Charles made an unprecedented move. He entered Parliament with armed soldiers. His goal was to arrest 5 members of Parliament, but they had already escaped. The Speaker refused to betray Parliament. The king's authority had been openly challenged. London now stood with Parliament. Charles was forced to leave his own capital. With both sides preparing for war, England stood on the brink of its bloodiest conflict in centuries. In 1642, Charles made his final decision. He raised the royal standard at Nottingham. England was divided. On one side stood the royalists, on the other, the forces of Parliament. This war would not only change armies, it would change the lives of every English family. England had officially entered civil war, and the first great battle was only days away. The fate of the English crown would soon be decided on the battlefield at Edge. October 23, 1642. The first great battle of the English Civil War began. The battlefield, Edge. Prince Rupert's cavalry drove Parliament's forces back. Royal victory seemed within reach. But Rupert chased too far. Parliament's army found time to regroup. As the sun set, neither side had won. England's civil war had only just begun. The conflict would soon produce a commander unlike any England had ever seen, Oliver Cromwell. Among Parliament's ranks, a new leader was rising. His name was Oliver Cromwell. Cromwell built a disciplined cavalry force. These soldiers became famous as the In 1645, Parliament created the new model army. England now had a truly professional army. This new army would change the course of the Civil War, and for King Charles, the end was drawing near. The decisive battle would come at Naseby, where the fate of the English monarchy would be sealed. June 14, 1645, the battle that would decide the Civil War had begun. The battlefield, Naseby. Oliver Cromwell's new model army advanced with unmatched discipline. The Royalist army collapsed. Its artillery, its supplies, and the battlefield itself belonged to Parliament. Naseby shattered Charles's hopes. From that day forward, the Royalist cause was all but lost. Defeated and on the run, King Charles would soon become a prisoner of his own people. In 1649, for the first time in English history, a king stood trial. Charles refused to recognize the court. He declared that only God could judge a king. But the decision had already been made. Charles was found guilty of treason and sentenced to death. January 30th, 1649, England prepared for a moment that would change its history forever. At Whitehall Palace, the axe was ready, and the age of absolute monarchy was about to end. On January 30th, 1649, King Charles I walked calmly onto the execution scaffold at Whitehall Palace. With a single blow of the axe, the King of England was executed. Europe watched in disbelief. The monarchy was abolished. England would now be governed as the Commonwealth of England. The death of a king marked the beginning of a new era. England would never be the same again. The monarchy had fallen, and Oliver Cromwell now stood at the center of a new England. But the story was far from over. The Restoration, the Glorious Revolution, and the rise of the British Empire were still to come.